Today's topic is a little awkward for me. It's an important topic. It's something that comes up a lot in the Bible, but I feel just a little bit uncomfortable talking about it. The topic today is persecution. The church in Smyrna was facing severe persecution from the Roman Empire, and they had been a group of people there who should have been on their side and instead betrayed them. And persecution is an important topic, but I admit I feel a little uncomfortable at times talking about it, because I think in America we don't really face that much persecution. I mean, the Bible talks a lot about persecution. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, "Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and say all kinds of evil things about you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they treated the prophets who were before you." Persecution is an important topic in the Bible. Yet, I think in America we don't face a lot of persecution, at least not compared to other Christians throughout the world or throughout history. Oh, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that I want persecution. I'm not a masochist. I don't desire pain in any setting. However, I wonder if, as a church, we have become too familiar with the world around us. I wonder if our faith should cost us more. A missionary friend of mine summed this up really well. He said once, when Paul came to town, they had a riot. When I come to town, they have a pitch-in dinner. So, now, don't misunderstand me here. I do think that Christians in America face persecution. It just tends to come more in the form of social pressure. Some of these examples are really obvious. If you've ever seen someone reject the materialism of our age, then you know what persecution looks like. It seems to really upset people. I kind of wonder why. Perhaps when we see someone else reject materialism, it reflects our own shallow materialism. But it certainly seems to upset people when someone won't buy in to the materialism of this age. Another obvious example is college campuses. This is one that kind of makes me sad. But liberal arts schools, which were founded on the idea of open education and exploring all ideas, have become not just questioning of religion and Christianity, but outright hostile towards people of faith. Christians nowadays have to assume that if they will speak openly about their faith, then they'll be reviled by students and professors alike. Other examples are less obvious. I want to tell you about a friend of mine I'm going to call Bob. Bob was not raised in the best home setting. I don't want to be unkind to Bob's parents, but I need to be honest to get this illustration to make sense. Bob's parents were takers. They believed that there was no one who was going to help them in life, so they were going to help themselves. And they took from anyone they could whenever they could. And that was the life that Bob was raised with. Then Bob met a man named Charles. And Charles showed Bob something different. He took Bob under his wing. He invited Bob to the church where he was an elder. He showed Bob a life other than just taking for himself. At least a couple times every week, Charles invited Bob over to his home, and Charles and his wife always made sure that Bob had enough to eat and clean clothes to wear. Charles did the work of discipleship. He never sat down and taught a Bible study with Bob, as far as I know, but he showed Bob the love of God. And that took hold. Bob began to see a life about more than just taking for himself. He was baptized into Christ. He began to believe that he could do more with his life than he ever thought he could. He wanted to go to college, to find a career helping others. And he went to his parents to tell them about this, thinking they would be excited that their son wanted to make more of his life. His parents said he had gotten uppity. Parents said that Bob thought he was too good for them. His parents said they had a fine life, and why would Bob want anything different? And parents tried to tear things down for Bob. They were fine with Bob spending time with Charles because Charles gave him stuff, but they didn't want him bringing this Jesus stuff into their home. Now, I don't have a clear-cut end to this story because it's still going. This has been a lifelong struggle with Bob. The more he tries to follow Christ, the more his family opposes him. And sometimes he steps forward in faith, and sometimes they pull him back. But it is worth recognizing that Christians do face opposition to their faith in America today. With that said, I'd like to turn to this passage in Revelations about the city of Smyrna. The second and third chapters of Revelations deal with 7 churches. Of these 7 churches, 5 had some pretty serious internal issues they were dealing with. The only 2 churches on this list that Jesus did not hold anything against were the churches in Smyrna and the church in Philadelphia. And these were the churches that were facing the most intense persecution from those outside of the church. The letter to Smyrna is a series of contrasts. First, Jesus in this vision contrasts himself. He begins by saying, I am the one who was dead, but now I am alive. The unbelieving world says that death is the end. After that, there's nothing, just black. But Jesus said that he is evidence that there is more than that. There is life after death. That he is the contrast to death because he brings life. And then he contrasted the church. He said, I know your afflictions. I know that your poverty. Yet you are rich. Not rich in a material sense. The persecution and opposition this church faced had cost them financially, but they were rich in spirit. They were rich in God. They weren't rich in the things of the world, but they were rich in the Lord. By the way, just a side note, if you ever hear anyone preach the health and wealth gospel, the idea that God desires to bless people with financial riches, point them to this passage. The church of these 7 churches that was most honored by Jesus is the one that was financially the poorest of these churches. And then Jesus moved on to talk about those who would persecute these Christians. He said that they were those who call themselves Jews, but they were not really Jews. That is, they claimed to be Jews. They were in the synagogue, giving lip service to the living God. But they weren't really Jewish because they didn't love God. They didn't care about the law of the Lord, because if they had cared about God's law, they would have honored the royal law of Deuteronomy, which says, love your neighbor as yourself. Instead of loving their neighbor, they persecuted their neighbor. This most likely came in the form of informing on these Christians to the Roman government. The earliest converts to Christianity were mostly Jews or God-fearing Greeks. It's a technical term that refers to people who worshiped the Lord but had not taken the final step to become Jewish. So those who remained Jews in Smyrna would have been in the best position to know who it was that was following Christ. And they could have protected the people who used to worship us alongside them. Instead, they turned them over to the Romans to be arrested, imprisoned, even executed. Jesus went so far as to call this the synagogue of Satan. That is, these are the people who should have known better. They knew the law of the Lord. They knew what was right. They knew the call to love their neighbor. And they still acted out of spite and hatred. People who don't know God act out of hatred, it's bad enough. But when people who know better still act in hatred, it's inexcusable. But then Jesus turned to the persecution that these Christians were going to face. He said that they would be imprisoned. They would suffer for 10 days. 10 days is probably a specific reference. The Romans had a rather advanced judicial system, but they still had a law at the time that said that even a Roman citizen could be imprisoned for up to 10 days without any charges being filed. Most likely this suffering for 10 days that Jesus was talking about is a reference to that the church in Smyrna was not doing anything that deserved a charge being brought against them, but they would still be imprisoned. They would still suffer despite the fact that they had not done anything wrong. But then Jesus closes with one last contrast. He says, if you are faithful to the point of death, you will receive the crown of life. The world thought it had won. The world thought it had sent these Christians to death and defeat. Jesus declared victory. He declared a crown of life that overcomes this world. So what do we do with this passage? I mean, as I said, Christians may face some opposition, some social pressure in America, but we don't tend to be persecuted, at least not at the level that the church in Smyrna was. Well, I think there are still two ways that we can apply this passage to our lives today. First, I want to ask you a question. What if? What if this happened in America? What if this happened to you? Suffering has a way of reminding us what is important. Persecution has a way of revealing where our hearts really are. So what if? If you face this kind of persecution, would you stand with the world or would you stand with God? Second way we can apply this is to remember that this is still happening. Christians are still being persecuted in the world today. The majority of people in the world today live in places where Christianity is at the very least restricted. And billions of people live in countries that are ruled by Islamic law or communist rule where being a Christian can get you killed. It's important to remember that in the 20th century, more people were executed for the Christian faith than in all 19 centuries before put together. So, what do? Well, I want to give you 5 practical things we can do for those who are persecuted throughout the world. First, learn. Learn what is going on in the world. As a nation, we largely ignore the suffering of those who are outside of our borders. We tend to think that if we can't see it, then it's not real. So take time to learn about the suffering of Christians throughout this world. If you were to look at the back of your bulletin, where the sermon outline normally is, instead you'll find a half dozen different websites. These websites are all reliable organizations that track the suffering of persecuted Christians throughout the world. Take time to learn what is happening to Christians. Learn about the persecution of this world. Second, pray. As you learn about the suffering of Christians in this world, pray for them. Bring their stories, bring their situation before God. You might not know these people personally, but God does. So take time to lift them up. Ask God to directly intervene on behalf of Christians who are facing persecution. Third, write. Most of the websites that are listed on your bulletin include ways to contact Christians who are being persecuted throughout the world. Write a letter, contact them, let them know that they are not forgotten. We are called to build people up. So build up the people who need to be built up. Fourth, donate. If God so leads you, provide financial assistance. Support those who are persecuted. Support the organizations that support persecuted Christians. And fifth, advocate. Let people know what is happening. The enemy's greatest weapon in persecution is silence. If no one knows it's happening, no one cares. So do not let those who persecute Christians hide in the shadows. Advocate. Speak about what is happening in the world. Do not let it go by unnoticed. Learn, pray, write, donate, and advocate. Persecution is very real in the world today. I've got one last thing I want to say to close out today's sermon. This is one of those things I honestly feel like I shouldn't have to say. There are a few things that to me, at least, seem so clear-cut and obvious they genuinely should go without saying. But in the world we live in, I think I have to say it. A week ago yesterday, John Ernest walked into a synagogue in Powell, California, and opened fire with an automatic rifle. He killed one person, he injured 3 more. Before his arrest, Ernest wrote a manifesto, a 7-page letter describing his beliefs and his aims. And if you were to read that manifesto, and I do not recommend reading it, it is filled with hate and darkness. Do not read it unless you have a compelling reason to do so. But if you were to read it, one thing you might notice is that it is pretty accurate in Christian theology. Ernest understood grace and redemption and the work of God, the redeeming act of Christ. He got most theology right, yet he somehow went horribly wrong. He took passages like this one in Revelations, talking about the synagogue of Satan. And he blamed all Jews for the execution of Christ. And he said that he thought God would be glorified by what he was doing. If you haven't already figured this out already, there is nothing in the Bible that supports hatred. For centuries, Christians have used passages like this one and perverted them to support racism and hatred. Instead of being cleansed from sin, they have allowed them to feed sin. But there is nothing in the Bible that supports this kind of hatred. We are called to love because our God is love. And if we are going to live in love, then we cannot take part in and we cannot tolerate hatred in any setting. Because God is love. He has loved us at our worst. He has loved us so much that he sent his son to die for us. Jesus did not come as a conquering warrior. He didn't come to kill his enemies. He came in self-sacrifice. He came to die for us. He came to live the sinless life that we could not live. He came to die on the cross, and he came to rise from the dead, victorious over sin and death, so that when we put our faith in him, we can have forgiveness of our sins and eternal life with God. He's called us out of the hatred of this world and into the love of God. In a moment, we're going to stand for our invitation hymn. And as we stand to sing, if you need that love of God in your life, if the hatred of this world has been pushing against you, and you need to push back with the love of God, you have an opportunity. As you'll stand with me now for our invitation hymn, which is number 338.